The flying car, the child catcher, and that unforgettable family adventure made Chitty Chitty Bang Bang pure childhood magic. But life beyond the screen was far less magical for its cast. Some battled addiction, others disappeared from Hollywood entirely, while several beloved stars met heartbreaking ends. Join us as we uncover their real names, their ages, and honor the legacies they left behind. Sally Ann Howes. Ann Howes played truly scrumptious at 36 years old, bringing elegance, warmth, and remarkable musical precision to the woman who gradually becomes part of Caractacus Potts' unusual family. Her extraordinary control was especially visible in Doll on a Music Box, when she had to move with the rigid precision of a mechanical doll. Yet the surprise came after the cameras stopped. Howes increasingly returned to the stage. She ultimately built a respected theatrical career rather than chasing disappearing movie musical opportunities. Her second heartbreak came more than 5 decades later. Howes had found lasting stability with her third husband, Douglas Ray, and their marriage endured for nearly half a century. But Ray died in September 2021. Only about 3 months later, Howes herself died peacefully in her sleep on December 19, 2021, at the age of 91. She left behind a distinguished stage career, a Tony nomination, major theatrical work including My Fair Lady and Brigadoon, and Truly Scrumptious. Adrian Hall. Adrian Hall was only 8 when he played Jeremy Potts, the adventurous young son of Caractacus, whose wide-eyed excitement made the family's impossible journey feel completely believable. Hall had survived 5 rounds of auditions to win the role, but what looked like the beginning of a promising child star career eventually became an unexpected obstacle. As he grew older, Hall discovered that casting directors struggled to see anyone except the famous little boy he had once played. He later moved away from acting, even removing the childhood credit from his professional resume as he tried to establish an identity separate from the role, before eventually finding a second career in drama education. He rose as far as principal of London's Academy of Live and Recorded Arts, but decades after escaping the pressures of child stardom, controversy suddenly returned him to the headlines. In 2021, Hall stepped down amid serious allegations concerning systemic racism at ALRA, throwing a very different spotlight onto the former child actor. The institution itself later collapsed and closed in 2022. Now 67 in 2026, Hall largely remains outside the public spotlight, leaving Jeremy Potts as the performance for which generations of movie audiences continue to recognize him. Dick Van Dyke. Dick Van Dyke played Caractacus Potts, the eccentric inventor and devoted single father whose impossible machines eventually turn one battered old car into something extraordinary when he was 41. His singing, dancing, and natural warmth made Caractacus feel effortlessly joyful on screen. But the cheerful performance hid a startling contradiction. Van Dyke was struggling with alcoholism during this period while also smoking heavily, even as the production demanded exhausting physical work from him. The elaborate Me Ol' Bamboo number became especially punishing, requiring repeated takes of vigorous choreography while he was already fighting alcoholic problems. It eventually became serious enough that he sought professional treatment. A second unexpected turn came decades later in his personal life. After losing longtime partner Michelle Triola to cancer in 2009, Van Dyke married makeup artist Arlene Silver in 2012 when he was 86 and she was 40. Their 46-year age difference immediately attracted skepticism and uncomfortable headlines, yet the relationship endured far longer than many critics expected. Now 100 in 2026, Van Dyke remains one of Hollywood's most extraordinary survivors, with a legacy including Mary Poppins, The Dick Van Dyke Show. Diagnosis, murder, 5 Primetime Emmys, a Grammy, a Tony, and recognition as a Disney legend. Lionel Jeffries. Lionel Jeffries was 41 when he appeared as Grandpa Potts, the eccentric, military-minded grandfather whose imaginary expeditions and constant declarations about traveling to India made him one of the story's funniest characters. The great joke was that Jeffries was actually about 6 months younger than Dick Van Dyke, despite playing his elderly father. Premature baldness had affected Jeffries from a remarkably young age, but instead of allowing it to limit his career, he turned it into an advantage, building a specialty around older, eccentric characters and convincing audiences he was decades older than he really was. But his most surprising achievement came after audiences already knew him as a comic character actor. Rather than remain trapped in those roles, Jeffries moved behind the camera, and only a few years later, wrote and directed The Railway Children in 1970, which became an enduring classic of British family cinema and proved that his abilities extended far beyond playing eccentric old men. He continued working as both actor and filmmaker before declining health gradually forced him away from the industry. Lionel Jeffries died at a nursing home in Poole, Dorset, on February 19, 2010, at the age of 83. Married to Eileen Jeffries for nearly 6 decades, he left behind films including First Men in the Moon and, most importantly, The Railway Children. Heather Ripley. Heather Ripley was only 8 when she played Jemima Potts, the cheerful young daughter of Caractacus whose innocence and excitement helped give the Potts family much of its warmth. For a child with almost no screen experience, the role looked like an extraordinary beginning. Yet behind that happy little girl was an intensely lonely experience that Ripley later remembered far less fondly. During the long production in London, she became so desperate for companionship that she reportedly placed a sign in a window asking other children to come and play, only for nobody to appear. At the same time, trouble at home deepened the pain as her parents' marriage collapsed, leaving Ripley to associate her sudden fame with a childhood that seemed to be falling apart around her. The second shock came when adulthood arrived and movie stardom offered almost no security at all. Her earnings had been held in trust until she turned 18, but she later said there was only about £7,000 available, and instead of continuing as a glamorous film star, she eventually worked ordinary jobs, including hotel work. Ripley later chose an entirely different life, becoming involved in anti-nuclear activism and humanitarian causes. Now, 67 in 2026, she lives quietly in Scotland, remembered for the childhood performance that made her famous, even though she ultimately chose to leave acting behind. Gert Frobe. Gert Frobe became Baron Bombburst at 54. Bringing the childish and tyrannical ruler of Bulgaria, whose hatred of children made him both ridiculous and strangely menacing. Audiences already knew Frobe as the terrifying Auric Goldfinger, so watching one of cinema's most famous villains transform into this flamboyant comic dictator added another layer to the performance. But behind his international fame was a political scandal serious enough to get his films banned in Israel. Reports revealed that Frobe had joined the Nazi Party as a teenager, creating enormous controversy around the German actor and threatening his international reputation. Then came an extraordinary reversal. A Jewish man, Mario Blumenau, reportedly testified that Frobe had helped hide him and his mother from the Gestapo during World War II. That testimony dramatically changed the story surrounding him, and the Israeli ban was subsequently lifted. He continued building an international career through films including Goldfinger and His Paris Burning, before suffering a fatal heart attack. Gert Frobe died in Munich on September 5, 1988, at the age of 75, leaving behind one of European cinema's most distinctive careers and a legacy later honored in Germany with a commemorative postage stamp. Anna Quayle. Anna Quayle transformed herself into Baroness Bombburst, the extravagantly spoiled ruler of Bulgaria whose hatred of children was played with such deadly seriousness that it became wonderfully absurd when she was 35. Her unusual appearance had its own surprising history. Years earlier, Quayle had broken her nose in 3 places after falling down a staircase while modeling, but on her father's advice, she never had it cosmetically corrected, eventually turning the distinctive feature into part of her screen identity. Yet behind that eccentric comic image, Quayle's final chapter became painfully different. In 2012, she was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, a progressive neurological disease that gradually robbed her of independence and forced the once vibrant performer to disappear almost completely from public life. For roughly 7 years, she lived quietly away from the entertainment world before dying on August 16, 2019, at the age of 86, with news of her death only becoming widely known afterward. Quayle left behind an unusually diverse career, including A Hard Day's Night, 85 episodes of Grange Hill, and a Tony Award for Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, proof that behind the outrageous Baroness stood an accomplished stage actress with serious theatrical credentials. Benny Hill. Benny Hill appeared as the toy maker at 43. British audiences already knew him for a completely different kind of comedy. Instead of his famously cheeky television persona, he played a gentle craftsman, secretly helping children in a kingdom where they were forbidden, creating one of the quieter and more sympathetic performances of his career. But Hill's enormous public success concealed an unexpectedly lonely private existence. Despite earning a fortune, he reportedly lived with extraordinary frugality, never married, and saw 2 marriage proposals rejected, spending much of his adult life without a permanent partner. His final years then ended in an almost haunting contrast to the millions who had once watched him. Suffering from serious heart and kidney problems, Hill died alone in his apartment on April 18, 1992, at the age of 68. His body was discovered only days later after concern grew when he could not be contacted. He left an estate worth millions and a comedy legacy stretching from The Benny Hill Show to The Italian Job, while the gentle toy maker remains a rare glimpse of a very different Benny Hill from the comedian audiences thought they knew. Robert Helpmann. Robert Helpmann was 58 when he created the terrifying Child Catcher, using the extraordinary physical control he had developed as a ballet dancer and choreographer to give the character his creeping walk, twisted gestures, and almost predatory elegance. The performance became so effective that the Child Catcher would remain one of the most frightening villains remembered by generations of British children. Yet the man behind that nightmare could hardly have been more different. Helpmann was reportedly gentle and protective toward young Heather Ripley and Adrian Hall during filming, particularly when the pressures of the production became difficult for them. Away from the screen, he shared a 36-year relationship with theater director Michael Benthall, and Benthal's death in 1974 reportedly left him devastated. Helpmann nevertheless continued working in theater, ballet, and film as one of Australia's most distinguished performing artists. He died in Sydney on September 28, 1986, at the age of 77 after suffering from emphysema. His legacy stretched far beyond one frightening villain. He starred in The Red Shoes, became a celebrated figure of British ballet, was knighted in 1968, and was honored with a state memorial service in Australia after his death. James Robertson Justice. James Robertson Justice was already 60 when he stepped into the imposing role of Lord Scrumptious, Truly's wealthy and intimidating father, whose booming voice and enormous physical presence made even ordinary conversations sound like commands. It was exactly the kind of authority Justice had perfected throughout his career, particularly through his famous portrayals of formidable doctors, aristocrats, and establishment figures. But the commanding man audiences saw on screen eventually faced a far more brutal loss of control in real life. During his later years, Justice suffered a series of strokes that severely damaged his health and increasingly limited his ability to work. The consequences were not only physical. With his career declining and financial problems mounting, the once successful actor reportedly fell into serious money trouble and was declared bankrupt. His final years, therefore, stood in painful contrast to the wealthy, powerful men he had so often portrayed. James Robertson. Justice died on July 2, 1975, at the age of 68, leaving behind a long British screen career dominated by unforgettable authority figures, most famously his work in the hugely successful Doctor film series. Desmond Llewellyn. Desmond Llewellyn played Coggins, the scrapyard owner whose sale of a battered old racing car quietly helped set Caractacus Potts's extraordinary adventure in motion when he was 53. It was a relatively small role, especially compared with the character that would define Llewellyn for generations. Q, the wonderfully impatient weapons expert who supplied James Bond with increasingly impossible gadgets. But after surviving decades of movie explosions and fictional danger, Llewellyn's life ended in a devastatingly ordinary accident. On December 19, 1999, he was driving home after attending a book signing event when his car was involved in a serious head-on collision in East Sussex. He was rushed to hospital but died from his injuries later that day at the age of 85. His death came only weeks after audiences had seen him once again as Q in The World Is Not Enough, making his final appearance especially poignant. He left behind one of the longest and most beloved legacies in the Bond franchise, appearing as Q across 17 films from Russia with Love onward, and turning what began as a supporting role into one of the series' most recognizable characters. Stanley Unwin. Stanley Unwin was 56 when he appeared as the Chancellor of Bulgaria, bringing to the character the wonderfully bizarre verbal style that had already made him one of Britain's most unusual comedians. His specialty was Unwinese, a language of invented and distorted English words delivered with such perfect seriousness that complete nonsense somehow sounded almost understandable. Yet the man behind that eccentric comedy lived a surprisingly conventional life far removed from show business chaos. Unwin had trained in radio and worked professionally as a BBC sound engineer, giving him the technical understanding of speech and broadcasting that eventually helped shape his extraordinary comic language. His private life was equally steady. He remained devoted to his wife Frances for decades until her death in 1999, a loss that came only a few years before his own. Stanley Unwin died on January 12, 2002, at the remarkable age of 90. He left behind performances including Press for Time, countless radio and television appearances, and above all, unwhinies that nobody else could quite reproduce the strange magic of hearing him speak it. Barbara Windsor. Meanwhile, Barbara Windsor made her brief appearance as the glamorous blonde at 30, giving us a tiny role that gave audiences little indication of just how enormous her place in British popular culture would eventually become. Her bubbly personality, distinctive laugh, and comic timing soon made her synonymous with the Carry On films before she reinvented herself decades later as formidable pub landlady Peggy Mitchell in EastEnders. Yet behind that famously cheerful public image was a private life that was often far more turbulent. Windsor's relationships repeatedly became tabloid material, including associations with figures from London's criminal underworld, while 3 marriages ensured that her romantic life remained under intense public scrutiny. But her most painful battle came much later. Diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2014, Windsor initially kept the diagnosis private before her husband Scott Mitchell publicly revealed it in 2018 as her condition progressively worsened. Barbara Windsor died on December 10, 2020, at the age of 83, after spending her final months in a London care home. She left behind Carry On, Peggy Mitchell, decades of British television history, and a cultural legacy formally recognized when she was made a dame in 2016. Peter Arne. You know, at 49, Peter Arne stepped into the uniform of Bulgaria's captain of the guard, using the stern presence that had made him a natural choice for military officers, suspicious authority figures, and sophisticated villains throughout British film and television. Although the part was relatively small, it fitted perfectly into a career in which Arne could make even a supporting antagonist feel immediately threatening. But nothing he portrayed on screen approached the horrifying mystery surrounding his own death. On August 1, 1983, The 64-year-old actor was found murdered inside his London home after suffering severe head injuries, turning what should have been an ordinary day into a major police investigation. Attention soon focused on a man believed to have been connected to the killing, but there would never be a trial. The suspect was later found dead in the River Thames, leaving many questions surrounding the crime permanently unanswered. Arne's career was therefore cut short in circumstances far darker than any of the villains he had played. He left behind decades of character work across British cinema and television, including appearances in The Pink Panther Strikes Again and Straw Dogs, remembered as one of those dependable actors whose face audiences often recognized long before they remembered his name. Davy Kaye. Davy Kaye was 51 when he portrayed the Admiral of Bulgaria, a small but wonderfully comic military figure whose exaggerated authority became even funnier beside Kaye's remarkably short 4'9" frame. Rather than allowing his height to restrict him, Kaye turned his distinctive appearance and explosive energy into an advantage, building a long career in British comedy, variety shows, and musical theater. Yet away from the exaggerated characters he played, his real life followed a surprisingly quiet path. Unlike many performers whose later years were marked by scandal or personal collapse, Kaye remained closely connected to charitable causes and largely avoided the turmoil of celebrity life, eventually settling into a more private existence with his family. His contributions to entertainment and charity were formally recognized in 1995 when he was appointed MBE. Davy Kaye died in Denmark on February 3, 2007, at the age of 90, after a career stretching across much of the 20th century. He left behind appearances in films such as Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, decades of stage comedy, and the legacy of a performer who turned what Hollywood might have considered a physical limitation into one of his greatest comic strengths. Alexander Doré. Alexander Doré took on the role of the first spy, one half of Bulgaria's spectacularly incompetent espionage duo alongside Bernard Speer when he was 43. Unlike many supporting characters who disappeared after a single scene, Doré's spy kept returning throughout the adventure, following Caractacus Potts, bungling surveillance missions, adopting ridiculous disguises, and eventually helping kidnap the wrong Potts altogether. Yet the visibility of the role did not translate into the screen stardom Doré might have expected. As his career continued, he found himself largely confined to comic supporting parts, rather than substantial leading roles, while the instability and competition of British entertainment made a life built entirely around acting increasingly uncertain. Instead of waiting for Hollywood to redefine him, Doré gradually moved behind the scenes, directing theater and working as a television writer, where he found greater creative stability. His private life proved remarkably steady as well. He married actress Edna Doré in 1946, and their marriage lasted 56 years until his death. Alexander Doré died in London on April 16, 2002, at the age of 78. Beyond his unforgettable bungling spy, he left behind appearances in Casino Royale and At the Stroke of Nine, along with decades of work as a stage director and writer that extended his career far beyond what audiences ever saw on screen. Victor Maddern. Victor Maddern played the rough-tempered junkman, the scrapyard dealer whose threat to melt down the abandoned Grand Prix racing car when he was 49. His screen time was brief, yet Maddern's naturally rugged face and intimidating manner made the character instantly convincing as the man Jeremy and Jemima desperately wanted their father to stop. But that same appearance became something of a trap throughout Maddern's career. Casting directors repeatedly saw him as the perfect soldier, criminal, thug, or working-class tough, leaving him heavily typecast and with relatively few opportunities to prove himself in dramatically different roles despite decades of steady work. Away from that professional frustration, however, his private life was remarkably stable. He married Jean R. Bem in 1946, raised 4 daughters, and remained with her for 47 years. His final battle came with cancer, which seriously weakened his health during his later years. Victor Mattern died in London on June 22, 1993, at the age of 75. He left behind an extensive character actor career spanning 7 Days to Noon, Exodus, and several carry-on productions, a familiar tough guy face that British audiences encountered again and again for more than 4 decades. Arthur Mullard. Finally, Arthur Mullard, who was 56 when he made his brief appearance as the big man, a rough-looking comic figure whose hulking presence added another eccentric face to the crowded fairground world surrounding the old racing car. It was a tiny role, but Mullard's broken-nosed appearance, gravelly Cockney voice, and imposing build were instantly recognizable. The same qualities that repeatedly cast him as laborers, thugs, and lovable working-class bruisers throughout his career. Yet the comic image audiences knew concealed an alleged private life far darker than anything seen on screen. Mullard had risen from poverty in Islington and worked as a boxer and manual laborer before becoming a familiar television personality, eventually finding wider fame through Use, My Dear, and his novelty duet of You're the One That I Want with Hilda Baker. But after his death, his daughter Barbara publicly accused him of years of severe domestic and sexual abuse, allegations that dramatically changed how his public persona was viewed and cast a disturbing shadow over his legacy. In his later years, declining health and chronic heart problems gradually pushed him away from entertainment. Arthur Mullard died in London on December 11, 1995, at the age of 85, leaving behind decades of British comedy and carry-on appearances, but also a legacy permanently complicated by the serious allegations that emerged after he was gone. So that's the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang cast, then and now in 2026. After nearly 6 decades, time has transformed those unforgettable faces, while many beloved stars are sadly no longer with us. Which transformation surprised you the most, and who will always be your favorite? Share your memories in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more then and now stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.